Okay, so what is this monstrosity that we see before us? Well, I've effectively taken all of the components out of the amplifier and screwed them down to a piece of MDF covered in aluminium foil. Why aluminium foil? Well, just to make sure that anything touching the surface is grounded. I've grounded everything separately anyway, it's just a little bit of added protection. Um, so you can't really see the right side of the PCB here. In fact, let's see if I can just flip it up. The main fault that we had with the amplifier, getting down low here, the main fault we had with the amplifier was the resistor going to G2 or grid 2, which I'm just trying to focus on there, was burnt out. So that has been replaced. That's just tacked in at the moment because I've been experimenting with different values. So once we had replaced that resistor, the amplifier did start working in as much as it was making noise. But one of the problems we had was because the way the volume of the amplifier was being controlled, what was effectively happening was there was a volume pot or resistor right at the front of the preamp on the actual instrument input, limiting the volume that was going into the amplifier, which would work, but what it actually means was the entire amplifier is on full volume the entire time, and all we're actually doing is feeding a quieter signal into the amp to keep the volume down. Now, I will admit actually one thing I have done during the course of getting this working when replacing that resistor and replacing the rectifier and everything as well, is we have roughly doubled the voltage going to these valves. Off the top of my head, I think they can run with the anode somewhere in the region of about 250, 300 volts. I think the amp will have been running with them somewhere in the region of about 60 or 80 volts. I forget the exact figures of what I've got them running at the moment, but they're definitely over 200. So they're going to be running a lot hotter than they were previously. The problem with that was when I turned the amplifier on, especially with no load on it, nothing plugged in, it just basically instantly fed back, started making Space Invaders type noises and everything really. So what I had to do was at the final amplification stage, I bypassed the audio signal to ground, just to stop it making any noise at all really, just so I could get all my voltages right. That's been done, and then as soon as that was done, the next thing I did was try to install a volume control between the two triodes. So the preamp valve, the 12AX7 or ACC83, whatever you want to call it, is actually two amplification stages, and it's very common to try and insert a volume control between the two amplification stages, rather than having it right in front of the amp. That would actually normally be, I think, what they would call a gain control on an amp, but it's not strictly speaking gain, it is the volume of the signal going into the next stage of the preamp. It's just that it will likely distort if you have it too high. But we like that. So I tried to do that originally, and that did help to some extent, but effectively once you got over a certain volume, the amplifier just went absolutely crazy. Now the reason for that, or at least part of the reason for that, was because originally I was trying to do this all inside the amplifier, and to make it easy to work on, I was using long wires. They were unshielded, they were picking up lots of interference, and as you can imagine, it's just like sort of sticking a nest of wires inside an amplifier that's on full volume. It just went crazy. So I had to take a step back and come up with this slightly neater breadboard approach. And the steps I've taken, well, first and foremost is the main output wire going to the output transformer, which carries effectively the speaker signal, is as short as possible and away from everything else. That's the thing that's probably made the biggest difference. I've tried to keep all of the input wires, or the wires carrying the low level audio signal, to the left hand side of the amplifier away from everything else. And I've also replaced the wires that are being used with shielded wires as well, which again have helped. The ways that the way that the volume control is actually attached at the moment is quite untidy, shall we say, because I've effectively had to, don't know if you can see there, I've effectively had to attach it onto the end of the capacitor, which was originally there because obviously the PCB is not designed to take these controls in that place. One other little modification actually was to add a little 1 meg stopper resistor between the input and ground on the input, which again is just a common sense feature that most modern amplifiers would have really, but for whatever reason this one didn't. Other considerations, I've added a fused mains socket for safety and because we get this cool little on-off switch which lights up when it's turned on. Another cool thing about that is because the original on switch was actually on this rotary knob which was set up to be the tone control, it actually clicks at the lowest extremity and that actually turns the amplifier on and off. And I don't know why that was done at all, because it seems silly to me that you'd have your on-off switch on the tone control. So I'm probably going to repurpose that as the master volume at some point. That seems to make more sense to me. But because we've got this on-off switch feeding the power transformer, and the power transformer then splits us into our 6 volt heater wiring and the 240 volt wiring for the rest of the amplifier, because the 6 volt wiring effectively bypasses this on switch, it means that when I turn on the main switch, it's effectively in standby mode with the valves warming up. And then when we actually want to turn the amplifier on, we turn this switch. So we effectively have a standby mode now, which it didn't have before, which is kind of cool. There's nothing really changed in terms of the capacitor. I've left all the original capacitors in. They seem to be working, so why not? I've just got a little central block of copper here, which I've been using as a grounding point, which is probably not ideal, but again, this is just temporary. I've moved the board capacitor onto the other side of the board. It was originally underneath, but by moving it onto the top here, it means the board can now be mounted flat on these little legs, which I've been using. So the plan is actually, hopefully, to try and mount the board. Originally it was sticking down inside of the case, right across the centre of the case, which was practically making contact with the speaker. I'd really like to try and get a 12-inch speaker into this box because it's big enough. So I'm going to try and move this board to one of the sides or the base of the case, or at least that's the plan anyway. Nothing changed with the output transformer. I've just used some slightly better speaker wiring, but again, that's temporary. It will be much neater once it's finished. So I got the preamp volume control in, and that definitely seemed to be doing its job. I would have said once I got back to about maybe a third volume or above, I was still getting quite a lot of RF interference from the power transformer. Now, this is an old unshielded power transformer, so it is going to cause some interference. And I was using a Stratocaster guitar with single coils to check, which is going to be the worst for feedback, but it was pretty bad. If I put the Stratocaster onto the second position where it's hum cancelling, then it was much quieter. What I found was, once I actually got that working and I added a master volume in, which would be just between the second stage of the preamp and the final power amp, that actually seemed to cure a lot of the interference just right off the bat without me really having to do much. So there you go. So as it stands at the moment, it is working as an amplifier with two gain stages, if you like, or at least that's how I'm sure they'd put it in the marketing material. It's not neat enough at the moment that I could resell it. I would definitely have to come up with a much neater way to to get that wired in, but we are, I think, to the stage where we can actually start trying to dial in the levels of tone and gain and everything we'd actually like from the amp. So that's where we stand at the moment. I'm going to have to return the kitchen to being a kitchen at some point, but in the next video we shall turn the thing on and let you hear what it sounds like through the original speaker, and then all being well we can try it through a 4x12, and then we'll have to make some decisions as to how we're going to try and voice the amplifier. Until next time, bye bye.